Hi everyone, in this recording we're going to learn about the steps you need to take in order to construct a good assessment. So we're going to talk about steps such as how to create a table of specifications, how to create an assessment blueprint, drafting the assessment, and determining your evaluation criteria. So it's very important that you pay careful attention to the information that I'm going to provide because you're going to be applying this information when you work on your key assessment in our class. So you will want to be familiar with it. So a table of specifications, I realize this is a term that you may have never seen before, and that's okay. That's why we have this class, right? So the idea behind a table of specifications is to give you a tool that you can use for taking a learning standard that you intend to assess and breaking it down into component objectives or learning targets to help you determine exactly what skills or what content knowledge you want to assess in the assessment that you are creating. So just a note about terminology, I might be using the term learning target here, but I use that term interchangeably with the term learning objective, like KUD objectives, which you've probably used and learned about in previous classes in the program. So just know that I'm using those terms to mean the same thing. So an assessment blueprint is a tool that you can use to determine, based on the learning targets that you've chosen from your table of specifications, so how many points or what percentage are you going to assign to each learning target, and which items or question numbers on your assessment are you going to match up to each learning target? So I realize that the information I just gave about a table of specifications and an assessment blueprint is a bit abstract, so I think it can be instructive to look at some examples. So I'm going to show you a couple that I've created as examples. All right, so let's look at this one first. So I'm going to scroll up here. So this is a table of specifications. Over in this column I have my learning standard, and over here I have my learning targets or my learning objectives. So my learning standard here is a 4th grade reading informational text standard that says describe the overall structure such as chronology, comparison, cause effect, problem solution of events, ideas, concepts, or information in a text or part of a text. So when I'm thinking about a learning standard, just like when you are planning to take a standard, right, and you write a lesson plan about the standard or based on the standard, you have to think a lot about like which skills or which content knowledge students need to master to be able to show that they can effectively meet the standard. So just like when you're decomposing a standard, when you're writing a lesson plan and thinking about how do I break this down into objectives, you do the same thing when you are creating a table of specifications. You have to think about what is the standard saying and what do students need to be able to do or be able to demonstrate to show that they've met the learning standard. So when I'm looking at this learning standard, students have to be able to take a piece of text and describe what text structure it is. And they have to be familiar with several different informational text structures like chronology and compare contrast and so forth. So in order for a young student, a 4th grader, to take a piece of informational text and decide, okay, it's this text structure, they need to know what each text structure is. They need to be able to define and explain those text structures, right? And they also need to be able to show that they can take a piece of text and determine what text structure it's written according to, or how it's structured, I should say. So given this learning standard, I developed 5 different learning targets. So one is that students will be able to define the chronological text structure and identify associated signal words. And this is a little peripheral to our lesson on assessment, but a signal word is a word that is usually associated with a certain type of text structure. So with the chronological text structure, it simply means that a series of events are being conveyed in chronological order. So signal words that might go with the chronological text structure could be something like first, second, next, then, later, after that. Those are signal words that readers can use to help them determine what kind of text structure they're seeing within an informational text. But that's a bit of a sidebar, but I just wanted to give you that information. And you'll probably learn more about that in your senior year when you take your content literacy class. But anyway, my second learning target is very similar. Students need to be able to define the compare-contrast text structure and know the signal words associated. 3, students have to define the cause and effect text structure and know the signal words. 4 is also similar. I want students to know the problem solution text structure and know the associated signal words. So learning target number 5 is a little bit different. Their students are expected to go beyond being able to simply define these text structures and know what signal words are associated with them. But in learning target number 5, students need to be able to take a passage of informational text and analyze it and correctly identify which text structure is being used by the author of that informational text. So that's my table of specifications. I took a learning standard and I thought about what are the component skills and knowledge students need in order to show mastery, and I broke those skills and pieces of knowledge down into learning targets. All right, so then I need to think about the assessment blueprint. So notice how I have my learning targets here in my table of specifications. You want to copy and paste all those learning targets into the column here to the left called learning target in your assessment blueprint. So sometimes it's nice to copy and paste because it's easy. You don't have to think much. All right, so with your assessment blueprint, that's where you need to decide how much weight you want to give each item or each learning target as you actually create your assessment. So you haven't actually created your assessment yet. You're just thinking about which learning targets should be given more weight or less weight depending on how important I think that they are. And you also want to decide which question numbers in the assessment that you are going to create are going to correspond to each learning target. So for learning targets 1, 2, 3, and 4, I decided that those learning targets would be worth 10 points each on my assessment, and my assessment's going to be worth 100 points overall just because it's a nice, easy number to work with. And I decided that each of these learning targets will be 10 points each because I feel like students are asked to be able to identify and define what these text structures are, which is a lower level of thinking if we're thinking about Bloom's taxonomy. It's not as challenging to do those things as learning target number 5, which requires students to take a passage of informational text and analyze it and decide which text structure the author is using in the passage. So that's hard, right? Because analysis is a higher level of thinking according to Bloom's taxonomy. So I decided that learning target number 5 is really most important in terms of meeting the standard that we see above. So I decided that I'm going to give learning target number 5 more weight. So that's going to be worth 60 points, whereas these others are only worth 10 points. So that's a little bit of my rationale. But as the teacher making this assessment, you need to be able to have some rationale behind like why you're building your assessment the way that you are. As long as you can justify why you're doing what you're doing, that's fine. But this is a case where there's no like hard and fast rules. You just have to use your professional judgment based on what you think is important as the teacher. And as the teacher, you're the expert. So you need to make those judgment calls. And this is a situation where you have to exercise that professional judgment. Anyhow, so that's how I determine the points that students would receive for each of the learning targets. And I notice here in this right column, I have question numbers. So on my assessment, I'm going to construct my assessment so that question number 1 and question number 8 are both about the chronological text structure. And I'm going to jump ahead for a second and show you my assessment. So if I look at question number 1, it says, which of the following describes the chronological text structure? So question number 1 should be about the chronological text structure. And if I look at my blueprint, I see that it is. So my blueprint also says that question number 8 should also be about the chronological text structure. And if I look at my assessment, sure enough, question 8 says, which of the following signal words or phrases would you be most likely to find in a chronological text structure? And yes, question 8 is clearly about the chronological text structure. So I'm matching my blueprint. So whatever you say in the blueprint here, if question number 4 is going to be about problem solution text structure, question number 4 in your actual assessment should be about the problem solution text structure. So you want to make sure that whatever you say here matches what's on your actual assessment. So once you've determined your blueprint, that's really half the battle because you've already done all the planning. Like you know what you're assessing and you know how many points things are going to be worth. And you know how many questions you're going to have and which questions are going to address which learning target. So that's really a lot of the work already done just by creating the blueprint. So then you actually draft your assessment. So this is where you need to take your blueprint and you need to actually craft questions that align to what you said you were going to be assessing on the blueprint. So you create your assessment just like this. So this is a multiple choice test, but it does have some open-ended questions here that students have to answer, which are somewhat subjective, but Anyhow, so that's my assessment. That's how I made it. And then you need to think about your evaluation criteria. So how are you going to score students? How will you know something's right or wrong? So questions number 1 through 8 in my assessment that I just showed you, those are selected response items. There's only one correct answer. Students simply have to recognize which answer is correct. So each time a student receives a correct answer, they get 5 points. And then questions 9 through 15 on my assessment are short answer constructed response questions, and students have to read a passage, analyze it, and determine what kind of text structure that they see, and they have to explain their thinking. So these questions are worth more points. They're worth 10 points each just because they require a higher level of thinking and more writing. Students simply don't have to just select the right answer. They have to choose the answer based on their own analysis and then explain like why it's the answer. So those are worth more points here. And I determined my evaluation criteria. I recognize that, you know, 4th grade students need to be able to read and comprehend informational text because, you know, at that point, as you've probably heard, students are oftentimes reading to learn, not just learning to read. So being able to understand informational text like nonfiction trade books and textbooks, those are important things for students to be able to comprehend. So I want to make sure that students truly have mastery of these text structures. So I've decided that 80% is the cutoff point to show that students have demonstrated proficiency with meeting this learning standard. So if I give students this assessment and they score an 80% or above, I can assume that students truly understand how informational text structures work and that they know how to identify them and so forth. So if any students took my assessment and they scored less than 80%, I could conclude that these students might need some more help with understanding the different text structures or perhaps analyzing the different text structures. So that's my evaluation criteria. So that's one example. That's a test that includes selected response and constructed response items. So let's look at one more example before we conclude this video. So this assessment might look familiar from a previous lesson, so I'm recycling it for this video. So you remember the assessment from the other week about a 4th grade teacher assigning students to write an opinion piece about whether or not students should have to wear school uniforms. So this is how I would actually construct that assessment. So my learning standard here is write opinion pieces on topics or texts supporting a point of view with reasons. And then I have substandards like A, introduce a topic or text clearly, state an opinion, and create an organizational structure in which related ideas are grouped to support the writer's purpose. So what's very helpful about some of the learning standards is that the writers of the standards have actually broken down the standard into subcomponents. And, you know, like we see with A and B and C here, right? That makes it really easy to write learning targets because the people who wrote the standard pretty much did it for you. You just have to rephrase it in your own language. So I determined that based on the standard and all these substandards, A, B, C, and D, one learning target would be that students will write an opinion piece with a clearly stated point of view. 2, students will write an opinion piece with a clearly stated conclusion. 3, students will write an opinion piece justifying their point of view with at least 3 reasons, each supported with facts and details. 4, students will write an opinion piece in which they organize related ideas. And 5, students will write an opinion piece in which they use linking phrases to connect opinions and reasons. So I pulled all of these learning targets by looking at these substandards here. Whereas with our previous example, we don't really have a lot of information there, so we have to think as teachers, what are the skills and what knowledge students need to master this standard, whereas here it's kind of spelled out for you, so it makes it easier. So I've written my learning targets based on this learning standard, and then I take my learning targets from my table of specifications and I copy and paste them right here into my assessment blueprint. So then I need to think about how much weight I'm going to give each of the learning targets. And you might notice that my assessment blueprint here corresponds very carefully to the rubric that you see here, which we talked about in a previous lesson. So this rubric should look very familiar to you. But anyway, so my learning target, students will write an opinion piece with a clearly stated point of view. So really that's suggesting that students need to write a strong introduction that makes their point of view very clear. I'm going to give that 10 points. And notice how here question numbers in this column, because this is an essay and not like a a test that has numbered items, I'm identifying which criterion I'm linking to each learning target. And the criterion corresponds to the rubric, right? So learning target number 1, I'm saying here, is linked to my introduction criterion. And my introduction criterion is shown in the rubric that I have here. So the student introduces the topic and clearly states his/her point of view. So when you are creating an essay type assessment like this, you would link, instead of writing question number 1, question number 2 in this column, you would tell me which criterion on your rubric that you would use to score the essay corresponds to the learning target, like I've done here. Likewise, learning target number 2, I want students to write an opinion piece with a clearly stated conclusion. That corresponds to the conclusion criterion, which I can find in my essay rubric here. It says the student clearly states his/her point of view and thoroughly summarizes supporting reasons. So you get the idea. So you make your assessment blueprint, and then what I would recommend doing with like an essay assessment like this is, after you make your blueprint, then instead of like writing up the actual assessment and the prompt, you might want to create the rubric first and then write up the prompt. And in this case, my prompt is write an opinion piece in which you share your point of view on whether you think our school should adopt uniforms. And then there's some more instruction about what I want students to do. But I would, if you're creating an essay, I would make your blueprint and then go ahead and just make your rubric and think about the different performance levels that you want to include in the rubric and how many points each one is going to be worth, and so on. So the process is similar to creating a multiple choice test or an open response test like we just saw with the text structures one right here. But your blueprint's just going to look a little bit different. And of course, when you're creating an essay, you need to have a rubric to score it. So then we've talked about the evaluation criteria before in a previous video, but I kind of justify why things are worth a certain amount of weight. For example, being able to justify your opinion with reasons is worth the most amount, or worth the most points on this particular assessment, just because that's really the heart of an opinion piece, whereas the introduction and the conclusion, while important, are worth a little bit less in terms of point value. So as I noted in a previous recording, 80% is the cutoff here. So if students score 40% or 40 points or less, I would most likely want to work with those students and help them with a re-engagement lesson to make sure that they understand everything that I've taught. And I want to do my re-engagement lesson in a different way, so that way they have a different way of taking in the information, and we'd want them to ideally be able to demonstrate mastery after that re-engagement lesson. So anyway, those are the steps to constructing an assessment, and please make sure that when you are creating an assessment in your class that you are actually going through these steps. What we sometimes see is people just create a multiple choice test and come up with a bunch of questions, and they don't really think intentionally about how they're aligning their assessment to what they're actually teaching. So in order to ensure that your assessments that you create have content validity, you need to follow these steps. I know it seems like a lot of work, but if you're creating a table of specifications, if you're creating an assessment blueprint, and then crafting your assessment and your evaluation criteria like I've shown you in this recording, it's going to ensure that what you are assessing in your class is actually what you intend to assess, and that it aligns to the learning standards that you're supposed to be teaching. So please let me know if you have any questions about this topic, and I'll be happy to help you.